Some of you might remember we used to do a meeting called New Community midweek. We are resurrecting that. We're going to call it intermission because it's kind of like an intermission, comes in the middle of the week, but we're not calling it intermission, intermission. Feel like when we understand the message of the Bible, feel comfortable with it, it really changes us, and that's the purpose of intermission. We're going to meet right over at Hope Resource Center, right across the street. Our office over there is between Fuddruckers and Subway. There's a small office complex. We're on the second floor. We have offices there and a room big enough to accommodate those who will come. The nice thing is that when you come, a little more informal opportunity to ask some questions. I'll have an opportunity to ask some questions of you, be interactive. We'll talk about some Hope business, about things related to facility issues, kind of Hope news kind of issues. It'd be family-ish, family time in that sense. And so I invite you to come to that. We're going to do it the first and third Wednesday nights of the month. And so that begins this week, 7 o'clock to 8:30 at the Hope Resource Center. Next week, you've heard the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus does a message that's similar, but he does it not on a mountain, in a plain. And so it's the Sermon on the Plain. And he touches on some issues that are similar to the issues he touches on in the Sermon on the Mount. But what he does, he uses very kind of images and analogies and metaphors to say some very basic things about love everyone, hate no one, judge no one. But he doesn't say it just that way. He says, turn the other cheek. Do as you would have them do to you. Take the plank out of your eye first. Plain talk. Plain talk about plain things. Makes sense. That's what we'll talk about. Mark, JC, and I will take a swing over the course of the next weeks to uncover those kind of things. So next week, we're going to talk plain talk. New message series. This week, we're talking about worshiping God. In 1991, a fishing boat left Gloucester, Massachusetts. It's very close to where I live. I grew up in Saugus, Massachusetts. You take Saugus, you can get on a bike, and it's about 3 miles to the ocean, where I hopped on my bike and then pedaled to the Atlantic Ocean. If you go to the ocean, you head north, you'll get to Swampscott, and you get to Gloucester. Gloucester is a fishing village, a lot of lobster traps, a lot of boats right on the shore, great place, good seafood. A fishing boat left from there looking for big fish, tuna, marlin, things like that. They went way out. And when they were out there, they did not hear that there were 3 storm systems converging. We have a storm system that is pulling this Siberian air into our region. I guess it's supposed to be here tomorrow as well. And so there were these 3 storm systems that converged to create a perfect storm. Perfect storm. And it tossed this boat. In fact, the boat was capsized and the crew was killed. It was, the story was told in the movie The Perfect Storm. George Clooney was in that movie. Job, in 10 minutes, is submerged in a sea of setbacks by a perfect storm of suffering. He gets hit in all 3 places that we don't want to get hit. He got hit in his business life. He found out that his holdings, his sheep, his animals, his servants, killed. There's just enough survivors to come and tell him that everything about all the catastrophes that had befallen him. And in one 10-minute period, he gets the wave. The first thing, again, business. Then he hears that his children, all 10 of them, 7 sons, 3 daughters, all died. A windstorm. They were all meeting. They were having a meal together, which they did oftentimes. They had a great family, all killed. Then he's recovering from that, and then he starts to break out in boils, head to toe. Perfect storm of suffering. The interesting thing about him, when he's submerged in this sea of setbacks, is that he survives. He survives these setbacks. And we've been looking at him, trying to figure out how. You know, the fact is that because he went through these things, he wasn't the same. He wasn't the same. Well, he went through some things at one time. As a Christian, some very difficult things. And I was talking to somebody about it. He goes, you know what, Mike? You're not going to be the same. You know, when you go through something like this, you're never the same when you go through something very, very difficult. He went on to say, you might be better. And that's what happens to Job. His faith, which was intact to begin with, is better on the other side. You know, we measure people by a couple of different things. You know, IQ used to be the big thing. Intelligence quotient. How smart are you? What's your number? You know, are you in the genius range? I think they say 165 and above. And then somebody wrote emotional intelligence. Daniel Goleman talked about emotional intelligence and the EQ, emotional quotient. And his thought was, if you're really smart but can't get along with people, how beneficial is that? If you can't communicate, you can't deal with people, so they talked about EQ. And I'm not sure about Job. He probably was as smart on the tail end as the front end in terms of intelligence. Emotions, maybe he was a little more in touch with grief and pain, although he seemed to be a pretty authentic guy. We know one quotient, his worship quotient, went up appreciably. He knew about God, knew some things about God, but on the far end of the experience, well, listen to what he says. After hearing the counselors come and give him an image of God that Job resists, God shows up. And so it's really funny that they're kind of blah, blah, God talk, blah, 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 God talk, and then God really shows up and starts to talk, and then everybody shuts up. And we get the sense that if God shows up, kind of casual, and, you know, like George Burns, and, oh, God, shows up in a fishing hat, and, hey, what are you doing here? And that's not what happens. Not what does happen when God shows up. God has some things to say to Job. Asks him, who is this that obscures my counsel without understanding? God says, brace yourself like a man. Let me ask you a few questions. Were you there when I made the foundations of the earth? And Job wisely just, what do you say to that? He'd been talking about God, but then God shows up, and Job, this is what he ends up saying. Job replied to the Lord, you asked, who is this that obscures my counsel without knowledge? Goes on, surely I spoke of things I didn't understand, things too wonderful for me to know. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. And so his worship quotient increases. He heard about God, but now he sees him, and his sense of esteem, his capacity to worship increases, because our capacity to worship is only as big as the object of our worship. Does that make sense? Our capacity to worship is really only as big as the object of our worship. If we have a small object, we might feel real good about that, but when you look at it, a small object only can generate a small capacity for worship. Job's picture of God gets so much bigger. His capacity to worship becomes bigger because there's more to worship. There's more that he sees, and he sees it more clearly. We're going to look at a couple things. We're going to look at the meaning of worship briefly, then the means to worship, and then that will set up communion for us, and we'll have a chance to be able to reflect there, and interspersed will be songs. We'll listen to Holy, 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 one of the great worship songs. But let's think about worship together a little bit. What's the meaning of worship? Really, when the Bible written in Hebrew and Greek, there's a couple words that are translated worship. But those words have slightly different meanings, slightly different roots to them. One, the meaning to worship means to bow in obedience and dependence. One word for worship has a root to kiss. It's when it's like almost to throw a kiss. And the way it was in religions, Greek, Egyptian religions, they had images that represented the God that they were worshiping. And so they took this God, this idea of a God, not really a God, but boiled it down to an image, and then you would prostrate yourself. And they even worshiped the ground. So I think with a word, one of the senses of the word was you kissed the thing that you worship. So you kissed the ground, and that might have been where the sense of bowing was involved. But it had the sense of bowing, falling prostrate before someone or something that you were seeking to worship. The thing that was different about Israel's God, that different from any God that was around at that time, God commanded specifically, do not make an image of me. Why do you think he did that? The reason why they made images, when I was in China, we got to see there's a lot of Buddhist temples, and they had images of Buddha. And what you'd find that there was a table in front, and people would come and bring Buddha things. And it kind of localized. And to see people, they were very devoted, very much into that experience. I watched once as people come in with the incense and with the offerings. They didn't have a lot of money. There was a table. Big picture of Buddha, and they'd place they'd stay there for a long time. Buddhist monks do all these kind of things. They get so wrapped in worship that they actually can pierce themselves, do things to themselves that think, how in the world can you be that focused? Why does God say, I don't want you to make an image of me? He had good reasons, perhaps. See, when we think about bowing, they thought that if they just bowed before an image and kissed it and gave it things, that was worship. But in the Bible, you get the sense that the bowing is really about bowing to the will of God, because that He has revealed and made clear. And that's the sense of worship. It means to bow in obedience and dependence, to bow in obedience. Look what it says in Exodus 12, verse 27. When God is going to lead the people out of Egypt, He tells them what's going to happen. Communicates through Moses. And here's what happened. Then the people bowed down and worshipped. And then it goes on to say, the Israelites did just what the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron. And so when they bowed down and worshiped, there was a sense of, yes, we will do what you say. So they got up, and their worship didn't stop when they bowed down. That was just the beginning of their worship. Then the real substance of their worship was when they went and did the things that God had asked them to do. To worship means to bow down in obedience and to bow down in dependence. Depending on the God, He would ask different things, command different things of you. Our God, the God who says, don't make an image, does say, call on me. Sometimes we become concerned that I shouldn't just call on God when I'm in a jam. Yes, you should. Because this is what our God commands us to do. What happened? It says in Matthew 8, a man with leprosy came, knelt before Jesus, and said, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Interesting, he knelt before Jesus, and that would have given people a lot of trouble. Because in Israel at that time, they were very concerned. You can't make an image. God doesn't show up. Don't make an image. Don't worship an image. Don't worship a person. And imagine being steeped, reared in that, very careful about that, because they had seen what happens to people who worship idols. People bowing down before Jesus. You know what? Jesus understood what they were saying, but He didn't tell people no. Why would He do that? Why would Jesus allow people to kneel before Him? Paul had people kneel before Him. He said, get up. Come on, no, I'm a man like you, when He did miracles. But when Jesus did things and people bowed before Him, He didn't say, get up. Why? Why do you imagine? He's saying something to us. What He's saying is, I want you to know, I'll accept that because I'm God. That's what He says. He's the Son of God, equal with God, taken on human form. That's why He let people kneel before Him. He was making a very strong statement, and people hated Him for that. Hey, you're not supposed to bow. Jesus says, I'm God. What do I need to do to show you that? I'll do miracles. I'll do those. And He did that. People still didn't believe. He said, I'll tell you what. Destroy this body, and I'm going to rise it up in 3 days. I'll raise it in 3 days. He did that too. Do you believe He's God? Do you believe Jesus is God? That's what He says. With His words, that's what He said with His acts. That's what He said when He received worship from people. And He, look what, as it goes on, the man with leprosy said, Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. Jesus reached out His hand and touched the man. I'm willing, He said. I'm willing. It's good that you asked. It's good you ask. Had the man with leprosy not asked, would he have been made whole? I don't know. I think Jesus wanted him to ask. I think he wants you to ask. That doesn't mean that you're going to get everything you ask for, but our God is a God who saves. He provides. He protects. He delivers from death. Goes on and says, immediately he was cured of his leprosy. Calling out is not just okay, it's commanded. It's okay to call on God in a crisis, but what I've come to think, you can't sustain faith with crisis praying, though. If we only cry out to God when we are in crisis, we get to the place where God becomes so irrelevant, we become disillusioned with Him. Because God will not always do what we ask Him to do. And if our faith comes just from His track record in doing what we want, I tell you what, I can't sustain my faith on that. That's why we look at the Bible. That's why we'll do it this week in intermission. We have to learn what it says, because faith comes from learning, knowing about the object of our faith. We have a big object. He tells us stuff here. He tells us, don't make an image, but listen to what I say. He says, I will cause what I say to be recorded. Why do we have a Bible? God's caused His words to be recorded so that we could know what He says. Why? Because He wants us to worship Him. He wants to teach us about Him. To worship means to bow down in obedience and dependence, to call on Him. And to worship means to serve. That's another sense of the word to worship, a different word. We find it worship in our Bibles, but it's a different word than is found and translated worship elsewhere. And this word doesn't so much mean bow down or prostrate yourself. It means to serve actively. To serve, to do the wishes of the one before whom you are bowing. But it says in Romans, therefore I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. That word worship has the sense of serve. So it kind of takes what the Jewish religion, Judaism was, which was very focused on sacrifice. And so what you do when you wanted to worship God, you would take an animal and you would have that animal killed, and there was some cost involved in that. You had to raise the animal, it had to be a good one, and that animal was put on the altar, and that was worship. And what Paul says, no, don't do that. You're to be the one that goes on the altar. I heard somebody say the only thing about that is we always crawl off, up and God, I want to do what you want, and I think what he's asking, though, is not literally be a martyr. That's not what he wants us to do. He doesn't want us to slit our throats. He's saying, I want your service. I don't necessarily want your martyrdom. I want your service. I want you to do what it is I would ask you to do. It says in 2 Timothy 3, in the last days, and it goes on to describe what people will love. People will be lovers of self, lovers of money, lovers of pleasure, rather than lovers of God. I'm going to say that again. People will be lovers of self, lovers of money, lovers of pleasure, rather than lovers of God. What does it mean by that? It means that when people are making decisions, they will ask 3 questions. Will it benefit me? Will it make me money? Will it give me pleasure? Let me see. What should I do? What will benefit me? What will make me money? What will give me pleasure? What occupation should I take? Well, what will benefit me? What will make me money? What will give me pleasure? It says, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. Is there anything wrong with pleasure? No. Living for pleasure? Yeah. Because if you live for pleasure, what God says, you can't live for pleasure and live for Him at the same time. Because He will not always, in this life, give you what will be pleasurable. So at some point, living for pleasure will go this way. Living for God will go this way. Until eternity, they'll converge again, and they'll always be together. But on this side of eternity, they will split. What's good for me? What does God want? They don't always. Ultimately, what God asks and commands is good for me, but in the short term, not always. Will it always make me money? No, it won't always make me money either. The path to money will go this way. The path to God will go this way. They don't converge all the time. It says, I urge you, therefore, brethren, worship me. Don't worship yourself. Worship me, God says. Don't worship money. Worship me, God says. Don't worship pleasure. To worship means to serve. We all worship. I read somebody say we are fundamentally religious by nature, all of us. We worship something. Even the person on a Sunday morning who would never get out of bed, would never go someplace to worship a God, that person still worships. What God would say, we all serve higher powers. We all serve masters. We all worship. We all worship someone or something. And in order to figure out what our God is, we look at what we value. We look at what we sacrifice for, what we put our hope in. Because that's what it means to hope in. What do we obey? What do we depend on? What do we put our reliance on and hope in? That's what Jesus said. Look what it says in Luke 16. It's an interesting story. In this story, there's a parable. He's telling a story about this guy who works for a master, and he tends his estate. And what the master asks this person to do, now listen, I want you to take care of my things, and I want you to take care of them in a way that is consistent with my values. Okay? And apparently this guy didn't do anything dishonest, but he did not reflect his master's values. He learns the master is going to let him go. And what he thinks to himself, uh-oh, I'm in trouble. He's going to let me go, and then I'm going to be free-floating, and I don't know what I'm going to do. And the master, so here's what, in the story, Jesus tells the story, here's what the guy did. He calls this guys the master's creditors. Didn't call them, you know what I mean. Gets a hold of them, says, hey, by the way, I know that you owe my master 200 denarii, and the juice, the interest might be, raises it to 4. I'll tell you what let's do. I'm going to cross out the 400, and let's make it 200. Would you take a deal like that? All the creditors said, oh, man, thanks a bunch. And then he did it again to all the master's creditors. And guess what happened? The master found out what he did. And in the story, Jesus tells, the master has a very strange response. He says to the servant, you have acted shrewdly. Shrewdly. Shrewd in that you were fairly wise. And in telling this story, this is what Jesus says. We talk about money. It's not wrong to have money. We all have to make it. I mean, what do? There's bills to pay. We have jobs that we've got to be careful with. We've got to save money. We've got to invest. You can't live without money. And here's what Jesus says, though. Use worldly wealth to gain friends so that they might invite you into eternal dwelling. You might be invited into eternal dwellings. I think here's the point. Here's this guy, right? Figures, okay, I'm not going to be in this job forever, so I'm going to think about what happens when this job is terminated. And I think what Jesus is saying, here's what his point is, you know what? We're going to leave these residences. I'm going to leave this thing. This is a body. This is like a tent, a temporary dwelling, a suit of clothes, and all of us. You look in the obituaries, you see people leaving their tents all the time. We're going to leave this tent. I talked to a doctor. He said, okay, Mike, you're 50. And, if you're reasonably healthy, you're going to live till you're 90. I don't know if I feel good or bad about that. Anyways, it's irrelevant. Now, what was my point? I can't even remember my point. That's what happens. You go down that road. Oh, I got it. Okay. So I'm going to move out. Maybe it's going to be 90. Maybe it'll be 4. You're going to move out of your house too. You can't stay in it forever. And what Jesus is saying, it's a wise person who acts in light of the fact that you're going to vacate that place, and will you be welcomed into an eternal dwelling? What's the point? Manage your resources in light of eternity. If you're going to amass a huge, huge amount of, why are you doing that? Have enough. Invest it now in eternal things. I think that was his point. Think in terms of eternal dwellings. If you're thinking in terms of resource management, time management, everything you have is resources, not just money but talents. If you're thinking of only in terms of the next 30 to 40 years, you're not being shrewd. The fact is, you're going to move out. I'm going to move out. Let's live in the light of eternity. That's the point. Now, here's what Jesus says when he brings this thing. And again, Jesus had a way of just going, and he just shoots the arrow right. That was a bad arrow. Anyways, no servant can serve two masters, he says. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Before I go on, I have this thought. Again, we talked about prosperity theology or anti-adversity theology. And again, I want to be careful. We have to have money, but money is seductive. I wonder what would happen if we took a number of different, think of the prosperity people you know. If over a banner, as people walked in, you cannot serve God and money. Think that would be confusing? To some, because some people who go there have their head on straight, but some don't. They feel like amassing wealth and serving God go hand in hand. That's a strong statement. You cannot serve God and money. At some point, will it make me money, and will it honor God, go in different directions? I think that has to do with business ethics, cutting corners in terms of getting more money, depriving laborers. I talked to Dan Bethke. He has a construction business. He was telling me about one builder who made, I think, $200,000 on a house. Was talking to somebody in a lumber establishment about, boy, imagine that $200,000. Now, what this guy knew is that this guy does not offer his employees insurance, no benefits. And the guy told him so. The guy at the lumber place, he goes, you know what I know? You should take a percentage of that. Give some insurance to your employees. What are you trying to make all that? And the guy probably lost the guy's business. It's a good point, though. I think it has to do with a number of different things. Sometimes, what God wants goes that way, and what's good for us, what makes us money, what gives us pleasure, going that way. He goes on, the Pharisees who loved money. Now, you'd never say to a Pharisee, do you love money? They'd say, absolutely not. Because they were devoted to doing what God said. They were. They did it full time. But they loved money, apparently. He goes on, they heard all this, and they were sneering at Jesus. He said to them, you're the ones who justify yourself in the eyes of men, but God knows your heart. What is highly valued among men is detestable to God. Our values indicate the object of our worship. What they really want, they were expressing outwardly, oh, God, I want you. But if you tunneled inside, they really wanted what money could provide for them. And there's a number of things we can worship. You know what? I'm not saying, okay, Mike, what are you saying? Are you saying, when I'm at work, I have to think of God 24/7? No. And that's why we'll talk about developing a capacity for worship. How do we become practical? But it does say, there's a verse, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. When our words say one thing and our lifestyle says another, and again, listen carefully. We all mess up, okay? I'm not going to point a big bony finger at you because I'd have to point it at me too. But just laying down the fact, I could say something, but what I say to God is not indicative of my heart. If I say, I love you, God, but 24/7 I am about my pleasure, guess what? I worship pleasure. If I say, I love you, God, I want to do, but 24/7 I'm about me, I love me and worship me. 24/7, if I'm about money, that's really all I'm about. That's my treasure. That's my heart. Then my lips say one thing and my heart says another. And the bad news is God doesn't listen to this. He looks at this. And when there's a difference, He's not confused by what we say. That's what Jesus, He wasn't confused. I don't like that. But it's the truth, and we can face it. Not everyone who worships is worshiping from the heart. I'm going to embarrass her a little bit. One thing I've always appreciated about Sheila Kittleson, she directs the worship, is that she's not doing a show. If you've ever talked with her and know her desire is to be transparent and to be up here and to reflect as best she can God and honoring Him, because that's really in her heart. I appreciate that about her. I think she's a woman of integrity. And when she's here, and I'm not, she has her issues too, but that's what I appreciate about her and I really like about her leadership. Did I just say something bad? Okay, I'm going to go on. Don't tell me. Somebody threatened me once that they were going to do a montage of things that I do up here. I think I'd kill myself if I do all these stupid things. I have all these stupid mannerisms. Anyway, okay. If I said something bad, Sheila, I apologize. Okay. The means to worship. Focus on the object of worship, not your feelings. Is there anything wrong with feelings? No. Sometimes when I was traveling back and forth to Wisconsin, there's a second chapter of Acts has a 3 CD set. Hymns. I love hymns. I'm a little older and I grew up with hymns, and I just go along and it's because some of them really touch me for some reason. And it feels good to get emotional. It feels cleansing. But it's not necessary, though. Not necessary. I talked to somebody who was talking about worship, and they say, boy, it's so good, and every time we worship, I cry. I cry sometimes. That's a great thing. That's fine. I guess what I want to say, though, it's not essential. Not essential. Talked to somebody who, they were at a meeting, and they were doing a lot of worship music at the meeting, and it became very expressive. That's fine. Again, I'm not blowing that up. But I talked to the girl who was there. Said, hey, what was that like? She goes, oh, I tell you what, the Spirit was all over that place. Spirit came down, was all over that place. What do you mean? Oh, she described, boy, we just got, felt like God was right there. A lot of feeling things. There was one time she said about, there was a song, and boy, the guy was up there, and God came down on him. We sang that thing over and over, and then it was interesting because I had talked to some of the people that were in the band. And the guy leading that worship before the meeting ended up saying, when we hit this part of the song, I don't want you to go on. I want you to stay, and let's stay at that part of the song and stay with the chorus. And so he had orchestrated the fact that God was going to fall down on the place, and the Spirit, but he kind of knew it ahead of time. It's not always authentic. The other side of this thing, some of us come from disciplines where we didn't allow ourselves to be emotional at all. I talked to one guy who was at a church, and they were planning the service. And then the pastor said to him, let's have 2.5 minutes of Spirit-inspired worship. And so, okay, and then 2.5 minutes of Spirit-inspired worship. What in the world is that? So we can fall on different sides of this equation. The point, I guess I want to make, focus on the object of worship, not your feelings. The object of worship, not your feelings. I think we can get focused on the feelings of worship. And if they're there, we feel like, oh gosh, yes. However, if there's a distance between this and this, in terms of what happens Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, again, not the big bony finger, but just, we can get a sense of confidence. Oh, I must be doing great because by saying that song, and that's not worship. Worship is not just feeling and singing and saying. It is obedience and dependence and service. In terms of the Word now. In terms of the Word. Look what it says. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples built by hands. He is not served by human hands as if he needed anything, because he himself gives all men life and breath and everything else. From one man he made every nation of men, that they should inhabit the whole earth. He determined the times set for them and the exact places where they should live. God did this so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. A.W. Tozer, there's a quote from him on the back. I'll read that with you in just a second. Here's what he said in another book. Sometimes evangelical Christians seem to be fuzzy and uncertain about the nature of God and his purposes in creation and redemption. In such instances, the preachers often are to blame. He blows up preachers. He said, there are still preachers who say that Christ died so that we wouldn't drink or smoke or go to the theater. No wonder people are confused. And sometimes we reduce God into being sometimes a moral custodian. And that's what we think of when we think of worship. We think of being moral. Worship has to do with focusing on the object of worship. And that's not you and it's not your conduct. Now, is conduct important? Yeah, we just talked about that. But worship is focused on the object of worship. He goes on elsewhere to say, again, Tozer, in Whatever Happened to Worship, that's the book. Another example of our wrong thinking about God is the attitude of so many that God is now a charity case. He's a kind of frustrated foreman who cannot find enough help. He stands in the wayside asking how many will come to his rescue and begin to do his work. Or give him money because God's on his last dime. And sometimes appeals are, come on, let's do it. God is God, but, he's not great at recruiting people, so I have to stand in his stead and try to... And we make God this small little... That's not God. Look what it says in this verse. He made the world and everything in it. He doesn't live in temples built by hands. And when we say, how did you like being in God's house? That's one reason I like being in an auditorium. God doesn't live here. But neither does he live in the places where again, I have a church building, that's fine. We're going to have to move out of here, Mark said, and find some other place within the next year or two. We'll keep you posted about that. However, whatever we move into, God won't live there. He doesn't live in temples built by hands. That's what it says. He is not served by human hands. And what does that mean? Does that mean we shouldn't serve him? Yeah, we should. He demands us to, but he doesn't say, oh, boy, thanks. If you hadn't done that, I just wouldn't have been able to, I wouldn't have known what to do. That doesn't make sense, does it? God is big enough. He doesn't need our service. Frankly, he doesn't need our money. He doesn't need anything because he existed before we did. He brought us into existence. It's like making a clay pot and then saying, I need the clay pot. I need what the... No, he made the clay pot. He made us. It goes on, it says, from one man he made every nation of men, that they should inhabit the whole earth. Iraqis? Indians? People from Cambodia, Sub-Saharan Africa? Americans, Canadians, Mexicans? Alaskans? People from Antarctica? New Zealand, Iceland? From one man he made every nation of men and determined that they should inhabit the whole earth. He determined the time set for them and the exact places where they should live. Does God want us to live in America at this time? I guess so. Does God want America to be here? Yeah, he does. Why? What is his purpose? Frankly, what's your purpose? If you are going to experience the purpose for which you are created, what are you going to have to do? Tell you what, it will be more than doing things to benefit yourself. It will be doing more than getting a lot of money or having a very pleasurable life. And if that's what you're living for, that's the only thing you're living for. Again, have fun. You're going to have to make money. You'll have to be good to yourself. That's all you're living for. You're missing it. You're missing it. Because it says, God did this so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he's not far from each one of us. For in him, we live and move and have our being. I'll tell you what. Again, if you're living just for those things, you might think that you're living and you're not. And you're making an eternal mistake. What God says, he says, here's why you were created. So that you would perhaps seek him, reach out for him, and find him. Because the fact is, he is not far from you. In fact, in him we live and move and have our being. God is closer to me than my next thought. I'm not aware of that, but he's here. The reason the atmosphere exists is because he exists. And there's a day that he is going to bring everything to a close. and He'll usher in eternity. There will be a new heaven and a new earth. And if all you're living for is yourself and money and pleasure, you will have missed the purpose for which you were created. The opportunity to know Him, all of us. Reach out to Him. Let's look what Tozer says, and then we're going to experience communion. I like this quote. I like book, The Pursuit of God. Let me read it with you. Every age, he says, now this is 50 years ago. If it's true 50 years ago, would you think this is true now? Every age has its own characteristics. Right now, we are in an age of religious complexity. The simplicity which is in Christ is rarely found among us. In its stead are programs, methods, organizations, and a world of nervous activities which occupy time and attention but can never satisfy the longing of the heart. The shallowness of our inner experience, the hollowness of our worship, that servile imitation of the world which marks our promotional methods, all testify that we in this day know God only imperfectly, and the peace of God scarcely at all. Is that true today? True 50 years ago? True today? If we would find God amid all the religious externals, we must first determine to find Him, and then proceed in the way of simplicity. Now, as always, God discovers Himself to babes, hides Himself in thick darkness from the wise and prudent. You don't have to know a zillion things to have God reveal Himself to you. We must simplify our approach to Him. When religion has said its last word, there is little that we need other than God Himself. The evil habit of seeking God and effectively prevents us from finding God in full revelation. In the and lies our great woe. If we omit the and, we shall soon find God, and in Him we shall find that for which we have all our lives been secretly longing. And he has this prayer. When I pray this, does it reflect your heart? Does give it up to God as we read it. And we're going to experience communion right afterwards. And we're going to invite you sometime over the course of the next song. We're going to play Holy, Holy, Holy. Great worship song. Listen to the words. And come up during the song. Grab the juice and the bread, because those things remind you of what Jesus did to come down so that you might see what God is like and desire to seek Him. Here's what he says. Oh God, I have tasted Thy goodness, and it has both satisfied me and made me thirsty for more. I am painfully conscious of my need for further grace. I'm ashamed of my lack of desire. Oh God, the triune God, I want to want You. I long to be filled with longing. I thirst to be made more thirsty still. Show me Your glory, I pray Thee, so that I might know You indeed. Begin in mercy a new work of love within me. Say to my soul, rise up, my love, my fair one, and come away. Then give me grace to rise and follow Thee. Up. Thanks that You do reveal Yourself. You would have us be aware of what You're like. And You need to shine Your light. I pray that You give us eyes to see, ears to hear. I pray that in worshiping You, we would find and experience the purpose for which we were created, to draw life from the light of Your smile, to reflect that light on others. Help us. Thanks for Your willingness to let us get to know You. In Jesus' name, amen. Hope to see you next week.